I was lighting the last candle on the dining table when my phone buzzed. Another message, another excuse. I set it down beside the crystal glasses, their rims catching the glow of the Christmas lights. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the street in silence. Inside, 12 chairs stood waiting. This is just the start of how I learned who truly cared when family didn't. Tell me, where are you watching from? I should have felt foolish for hoping. Instead, I felt something colder than regret. The ham rested untouched, the wine unopened. My children, my sister, all of them had chosen somewhere else to be. The silence pressed against me, heavy and merciless. And yet in that stillness, a strange clarity stirred. If love could not be shared here, then I would take it elsewhere. So let's get into what happened after that Christmas evening. The house still smelled of cloves and cinnamon, but it felt like a museum. Every detail polished, every dish prepared, and not a single person to witness it. I poured myself a glass of wine, though the taste was flat without conversation to go with it. I had built the night around others, and all I was left with was the sound of the clock ticking past 7, then 8, then 9. I kept waiting for headlights in the driveway, kept thinking maybe one of them would surprise me. That's what hope does. It hangs on even when reason has already given up. I walked past the living room window a dozen times, scanning for shadows moving across the snow. Each time there was nothing, just the quiet street, the glow of other families' windows, laughter I couldn't hear but imagined. Eventually, I sat down at the head of the table, as if I were hosting myself. The place cards mocked me. My daughter's name in curling script, my son's beside hers, my sister's across from me. I thought of all the hours I'd spent baking pies and wrapping small gifts to set at each plate. I had wanted to make it perfect, as though perfection might hold us together. Instead, it only revealed the cracks more sharply. Memory pulled me back to the last Christmas we'd all spent under one roof. My husband was still alive then. The kids had been younger, less busy, less hardened by their own lives. I could still hear his deep voice calling them to the table, his laugh filling the spaces mine couldn't. Back then, the idea of an empty holiday would have seemed impossible. Now it was my reality. I kept replaying the says I'd read earlier. One child caught up at work, another visiting in-laws, my sister saying the roads were bad though she lived barely an hour away. Maybe all of those things were true. Maybe none of them were. What mattered was that none of them chose to be here. Not with me. After a while, the food didn't look like food anymore. The turkey browned to leather, the potatoes stiffened, the pies sagged. I wrapped them up one by one, my hands moving slower with every dish. It wasn't just the cleanup, it was the weight of the question echoing inside me. What was I holding on for? I went upstairs to change out of the dress I'd chosen for the evening. Sequined, festive, bought months ago with this dinner in mind. I slipped into a sweater instead and stared at myself in the mirror. The reflection staring back was a woman still waiting for someone else to decide her worth. That realization stung more than the silence of the house. By 10 o'clock, I couldn't sit anymore. I put on my boots and coat and stepped outside. The air bit at my cheeks, sharp and honest in a way people rarely are. Across the street, my neighbor's house was alive, music drifting out, cars lined up along the curb, kids darting in and out with mittens and scarves. I almost turned back inside, ashamed to be caught alone on Christmas. But then a wave of voices spilled out as the door opened. They didn't look lonely. They looked full. Something in me shifted then. Maybe I didn't need to keep begging for a seat at the wrong table. Maybe I could find a place where my presence wasn't a burden, where I wasn't just an obligation that could be crossed off with a quick message. That thought was the first flicker of rebellion against years of quiet endurance. I walked back inside, snow melting on my coat, and sat at the desk in my study. The bills, the checkbook, the folder of financial documents, all the things I'd been saving, guarding, setting aside for children who no longer showed up. For years, I had believed that giving was proof of love, that if I provided enough, smoothed enough rough edges, the people I loved would stay close. But love doesn't work that way. It can't be bribed or bought. I sat there staring at the numbers, the total I had planned to one day leave behind. $500,000, meant for family who couldn't even make it through my front door on the one night I'd asked. The unfairness of it all burned through me, but beneath the burn, there was a steadier truth. I had the power to decide where this money went, and maybe, for once, I could choose myself in the process. By midnight, the decision had started forming in my mind. I didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, but I knew this much. I was done waiting. Done setting plates for people who never arrived. Done giving pieces of myself to those who didn't notice when they were gone. That night marked the end of one chapter and the fragile beginning of another. The idea stayed with me long after midnight, sitting heavy but alive. It wasn't just a passing frustration, the kind that fades after sleep. No, this felt sharper, more certain. For once, the thought of change didn't scare me. It steadied me. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight pouring through the blinds. The house was still too quiet, the leftovers still sitting in the fridge, but something in me had shifted. I walked into the study, opened the drawer where I kept my accounts, and pulled everything out. Stacks of papers, bank records, investment notes. It looked like the life of a woman waiting to be remembered. I didn't want to be remembered that way. I made coffee, sat down at the desk, and started writing. Not a letter, not a will. Just a list of people who had shown up in my life when no one else did. My neighbor who shoveled my driveway without being asked. The nurse at the clinic who always remembered my husband's name years after he passed. The librarian who set aside books she thought I'd like. Small gestures, but gestures that mattered. The list grew longer than I expected. I realized I wasn't as invisible as I thought. I had been seen, just not by the people I had been bending myself backward for. That recognition lit something inside me. Of course, doubt crept in too. $500,000 isn't pocket change. It was money I had once thought would secure my children's futures, keep them comfortable, maybe even soften whatever distance had formed between us. Giving it away to anyone else felt reckless. But then I remembered last night, the empty table, the cold food, the way my phone stayed silent after their excuses. Comfort for them had come at the cost of loneliness for me. By noon, I called my lawyer. She sounded surprised to hear from me the day after Christmas, but she agreed to meet later in the week. "Are you sure you want to make changes right now?" she asked gently, as though waiting for me to come to my senses. "Yes," I said, steady. "I'm sure." The days leading up to the meeting, I kept moving through the motions of daily life. I cleared out the leftovers, packed them up for the shelter down the street. The staff there looked shocked when I arrived with trays of food, but their gratitude was genuine. I stood in that small kitchen watching people line up for plates, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, needed. That night, I slept without tossing, without running through what-ifs. My decision felt less like rebellion now, and more like truth. When I sat in my lawyer's office, snow still clinging to my boots, I laid it all out. I wanted the bulk of my estate redirected, not to my children, not to my sister, but to people and places that had made me feel less alone. Charities, community centers, a few individuals who had shown kindness without asking for anything in return. She looked at me with raised brows. "This is a significant change. They might contest it, you know." "I know," I said, "but they won't win. Because what's written here is mine to decide." We spent 2 hours drafting the documents. Each signature I made felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. For once, I wasn't waiting for approval or begging for attention. I was directing my own story. Afterward, I walked out into the winter air feeling lighter. The streets were still decorated with holiday wreaths, though most families were packing away their celebrations. For me, the holiday had just begun, even if it looked nothing like I imagined. I started small, testing the edges of this new choice. I donated part of the money to the local shelter where I'd left the food. I saw how quickly they put it to use: new blankets, hot meals, medical supplies. They called me later that week, voices full of gratitude I could feel through the phone. Word began to spread, though I hadn't meant for it to. Neighbors noticed when the community center received a new roof, when the library started a new program for seniors. People started dropping by my house, not to pry, but to thank me. Each time, I felt less like the forgotten woman at an empty table, and more like someone who mattered. But family has a way of noticing when money moves, especially money they expected to inherit. It didn't take long before the phone calls started. At first, they were polite. "Mom, I heard you've been making donations. That's nice, but don't you think you should slow down?" Then, more pressing, "Why didn't you tell us? We should be part of these decisions." I listened. I didn't argue, but I didn't explain myself either. They had skipped the dinner I set for them. They had chosen absence. This was the consequence. By New Year's Eve, I hosted a different kind of gathering. Not family. Neighbors, volunteers from the shelter, the librarian, even the nurse from the clinic. My dining room was full for the first time in years. People passed plates, shared stories, laughed until the walls seemed to hum with warmth. I watched from the head of the table again, but this time I didn't feel mocked by empty seats. Every chair was filled. When the clock struck midnight, we clinked glasses and cheered to a new year. My heart swelled, not with regret for who wasn't there, but gratitude for who was. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for my family's approval. I had already found my place. The house was still warm from that New Year's gathering when the first real confrontation came. My daughter showed up at my door 2 days later, her car crunching across the icy driveway. She didn't call ahead. She just appeared, cheeks red from the cold, eyes sharp with something I couldn't quite place. I opened the door and let her in. She glanced around the living room as if expecting to see strangers still sitting at the table. Instead, she found only the remnants of celebration, a stack of empty glasses, confetti in the corners, leftover laughter still echoing faintly in my ears. "Mom," she began, setting her bag down. "We need to talk." I made tea, the way I always did when she was upset, and waited. She didn't bother with small talk. "Is it true? You've been giving away money? Big money?" I nodded. "It's true." Her eyebrows tightened. "Why? Why would you do that without telling us? Don't you think that's a little extreme?" Her tone was sharp, but underneath it was something else. Fear, maybe. The fear of losing what she thought unpicked was hers. I sipped my tea slowly before answering. Because I wanted it to mean something. Because last Christmas, I sat alone in a house full of food and empty chairs, and I realized I didn't want to leave everything I worked for to people who couldn't even show up. She blinked, stunned. For once, she didn't have a quick response. When she did speak, her words were quieter. "We're your family." I set my cup down. Family isn't supposed to be conditional. Family is presence, care, respect. I haven't felt that from you in a long time. The silence stretched between us, heavier than any snow piling up outside. Finally, she muttered something about needing to go, grabbed her bag, and left without finishing her tea. I didn't stop her. For years, I had begged for more time, more attention, more effort. Not anymore. In the days that followed, the rest of the family joined in. Calls, texts, messages that grew sharper with each attempt. My son accused me of acting rashly. My sister called me selfish. The same people who hadn't shown up at my door suddenly couldn't stop reaching for me, but it wasn't me they wanted. It was what I had once promised them without saying a word. I thought it would break me, that kind of backlash. Instead, it clarified everything. Each argument, each guilt-laced accusation only reminded me of how little they valued me for myself. Their words weren't about love. They were about loss, loss of control, loss of an inheritance they had already counted on. Meanwhile, the community kept showing me the opposite. At the shelter, they invited me to sit and share meals. At the library, a plaque appeared with my name on it, thanking me for the program I'd funded. Strangers stopped me in the grocery store to tell me what the new center meant to them. They weren't polished words. They weren't rehearsed. They were real. And that was all I had ever wanted. Still, I won't lie. It hurt. I would go to bed some nights wishing my children had chosen differently, wishing I didn't have to choose between blood and belonging. But when morning came, the truth always returned with it. They had made their choice long before I made mine. One afternoon, while I was packing up boxes of old holiday decorations to donate, I found an ornament tucked away in the bottom of a bin, a photograph sealed inside. My husband holding the kids when they were small, all of them grinning with sticky candy canes in their hands. I sat on the floor staring at it for a long time. That was the family I remembered, the family I had built my hopes around. The distance between then and now felt like a canyon I could never cross. But instead of drowning in grief, I placed the ornament on the mantel. A reminder, not of what I'd lost, but of the love I'd once known. That love wasn't gone. It lived in me, and I could choose where to pour it now. By February, the backlash escalated. My sister called again, this time less accusatory, more desperate. "Think about the grandchildren," she pleaded. "You're robbing them of a future." I took a breath, steady and even. "No," I said. "I'm giving them something better, a lesson, that you cannot neglect people and still expect to reap their rewards. If they want me in their future, they'll have to show me in the present." She hung up not long after, her silence sharp. I sat there staring at the phone, my hands trembling slightly. It wasn't easy to stand so firm, but I didn't waver. In the midst of all this, invitations began arriving from people I had barely known before. A neighbor asked if I'd join her quilting circle. A volunteer from the shelter wanted me to see the new wing they were opening with my donation. Every week, my calendar filled with things that once would have felt impossible. And the strange part? I wasn't lonely anymore. By spring, the decision that had once seemed so radical now felt like the most natural thing in the world. My family's anger hadn't softened, but my resolve had strengthened. I no longer looked out the window waiting for their cars in the driveway. I no longer set places at the table for people who wouldn't come. Instead, I built a new table, one filled with neighbors, friends, even strangers who became companions. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was living in a house too big for one. I was living in a home again. By summer, my days looked nothing like the life I once knew. My mornings started at the community center, where kids ran through the halls clutching backpacks I'd helped fund. Afternoons were often spent at the library, now buzzing with seniors learning new skills in the program I had sponsored. In the evenings, neighbors dropped by with pies or just to sit on the porch and talk while the sun sank low. I thought the storm with my family might pass, that time might soften their anger. It didn't. Instead, their silence grew louder, broken only by the occasional message reminding me of what they believed I had taken from them. They didn't ask about my health. They didn't ask how I was spending my days. They asked only about money. One night in July, I answered a call from my son. His voice was clipped, the kind he used when he was trying to sound reasonable but was really on edge. "Mom, I've been looking into what you've done. This isn't right. That money was supposed to stay in the family." I leaned back in my chair, listening to the crickets outside. "The money is mine," I said quietly. "And family is more than a bloodline. You've shown me that." There was a pause, then the sound of him exhaling hard. "So what? You're replacing us? With strangers?" "No," I answered. I'm surrounding myself with people who care. That's not replacement. That's survival." He hung up without another word. I sat there holding the phone, feeling the ache of what could have been, but also the steadiness of knowing I had finally spoken a truth I'd been swallowing for years. The next morning, I joined the quilting group my neighbor had invited me to. We sat in a circle stitching squares for a blanket that would be auctioned to raise funds for the shelter. I wasn't the best at sewing, but no one cared. They teased me, corrected me, showed me new stitches. For the first time in a long while, I felt it part of something that didn't require me to earn my place. That sense of belonging deepened in August when the shelter invited me to a ceremony to unveil their new wing. My donation had made it possible, but I wasn't expecting recognition. When I arrived, though, there was a small plaque on the wall with my name. People clapped. Some hugged me. A woman I'd never met before pressed my hands in hers and whispered, "You saved my life." I drove home that evening with tears rolling down my face. Not tears of regret, not tears of longing, but tears of relief. For so long I had wondered if I mattered. Now I knew I did. But family doesn't stay silent forever when they feel cornered. By September, letters from my daughter's lawyer arrived. Polite but firm, demanding explanations, suggesting incompetence, hinting that maybe I wasn't in the right state of mind to make such decisions. I took the stack of papers straight to my lawyer. She skimmed them, her expression tight but unsurprised. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said, "but they don't have a case. You've been clear, consistent, and sound. This will not stand up in court." Even with her assurance, the letters rattled me. Not because I feared losing, but because of what it revealed. That my daughter, the girl I had once rocked to sleep, the young woman I had once cheered for in every milestone, was willing to paint me as unfit if it meant regaining control of money she believed was hers. That night, I sat on the porch long after the crickets had gone quiet, staring at the stars. I thought about my husband, about what he would have said. He would have been heartbroken to see how fractured things had become, but he also would have told me to stand my ground. He always said, "Dignity isn't given, it's claimed." So I stayed the course. I kept giving, kept showing up at the places that made me feel alive. My circle grew, people of all ages, backgrounds, and stories. They weren't bound to me by blood, but by something stronger: choice. By October, I realized something unexpected. I no longer flinched when the phone rang. I no longer dreaded checking the mailbox. My family's attempts to pull me back into guilt had lost their hold. I wasn't hardened. I still loved them. But I no longer mistook their absence for a reflection of my worth. The season turned. Leaves fell. The air cooled. As I raked the yard one afternoon, a neighbor's child came running up, her small hands clutching a drawing she'd made, a house, a sun, stick figures smiling together. In the corner, she had scrawled my name. "You're part of our family now," she said proudly before running back to her mother. I held that piece of paper in my hands and felt a warmth no inheritance could ever buy. That drawing from the neighbor's child stayed on my refrigerator door for weeks. Every time I passed by it, I felt a tug in my chest. It was simple, crooked lines and bright crayon colors, but it represented something larger, a truth I had been slow to accept. Family isn't only who you are tied to by birth. Family is who shows up, who sees you, who includes you, without condition. As autumn deepened, I leaned more into that truth. The community center asked if I would sponsor a Thanksgiving dinner for families who couldn't afford one. I agreed without hesitation and spent the week helping organize turkeys, stuffing, pies, and volunteers. On the day of the dinner, the gymnasium filled with voices, laughter, and the clatter of plates. When I stood back watching everyone eat, I felt more at home than I had in my own dining room the previous year. Of course, my family didn't let the season pass quietly. My son showed up the next morning, unannounced, his expression tight with frustration. He didn't sit, didn't remove his coat, just stood in the doorway like a man on a mission. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said, "giving money away like this. Do you even realize what people are saying? You're being used." I met his eyes. Used or valued? Because I can tell you the difference now. He shook his head, anger flashing. "You raised us to believe in responsibility, and now you're throwing away the very thing you worked for all your life." I didn't raise my voice. "I worked for a life filled with love. I didn't get that from you. I'm building it where I can." His jaw tightened. He turned and left without saying another word. I let him go because I had learned that chasing people who didn't want to stay was a waste of breath. Later that evening, I sat with a neighbor on the porch, sharing leftover pie from the community dinner. She asked if I regretted it, giving away money that most people would cling to. I thought about her question, really sat with it, then answered. "No, I regret waiting so long to realize I deserved better." December arrived, and with it, the weight of another Christmas. This time, though, I wasn't waiting for apologies or last-minute calls. I filled my calendar with events at the shelter, gatherings at the library, dinners with friends. The house didn't feel like a museum anymore. It felt lived in. Still, I braced myself for the inevitable. My daughter called a week before Christmas, her voice clipped. "Mom, we're coming this year. The kids miss you." A part of me softened at those words, but another part braced. "You're welcome," I said. "But understand, this isn't about money. If you come because you want to be here, not because of what you think you'll gain." She hesitated. "Of course," she replied quickly, but something in her tone made me wonder if she meant it. When Christmas Day came, I hosted a gathering again, but not just for family. Neighbors, friends, volunteers, even some of the children from the community center came. My table was longer this time, extended with extra boards and mismatched chairs. Every seat was filled, the air thick with conversation and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread. My daughter and her kids arrived late, stepping into a house already alive with noise and warmth. She looked around, surprised, maybe even unsettled, to see strangers sitting in the places she once assumed would always belong to her. I greeted them, hugged my grandchildren, and guided them to the table. But I didn't bend myself into knots to make it perfect for them. I simply folded them into the space that already existed. For most of the meal, she stayed quiet, watching. When dessert came, she leaned over and whispered, "This feels different." "It is," I said simply, "because I am different." That night, after everyone had left and the house had gone still again, I stood in the doorway looking at the empty chairs. But this time, they weren't symbols of abandonment. They were signs of a night well lived, of people who had come and gone with their presence felt. I realized then that I had created the Christmas I always wanted, not with the family I was born into, but with the family I had built through choice and kindness, and strangely enough, it felt more genuine than anything I'd held on to before. The days after that Christmas were quiet but not empty. For once, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt earned. I spent mornings tidying the house, afternoons visiting the library or shelter, evenings walking with neighbors who had become friends. Life no longer circled around waiting for my family's approval. It circled around what filled me. Still, the shift unsettled my daughter. A week after the holiday, she called again. Her voice sounded forced, polite in a way that didn't reach her words. "Mom, the kids loved seeing you, but they asked why you had strangers at the table. Why not just keep it family?" I sat with her question before answering. "Because family hasn't kept me, and I won't shrink my life down to fit what makes you comfortable. The people at that table were there because they wanted to be." She went quiet, and I could hear her breathing through the phone. Finally, she muttered, "You've changed." "Yes," I said softly. I had to. Not long after, more letters came from her lawyer. This time the tone was harder, pressing into threats of legal action. They demanded to see records of my donations, tried to frame them as reckless. My lawyer assured me again that I was fine, but the pressure mounted. Every envelope in the mailbox felt like a reminder of how far my daughter was willing to go. I didn't cry this time. I didn't plead. Instead, I walked those letters straight to my lawyer, signed whatever was needed, and walked back out with my head higher than it had been in years. One evening in late January, I attended a fundraiser at the shelter. It wasn't fancy, folding chairs, paper banners, a potluck dinner, but the room buzzed with gratitude. People shared stories of finding jobs, finding homes, finding hope. When they introduced me, the applause was louder than anything I had ever heard from my own family. I stood there, my hands trembling, realizing that my giving wasn't just money. It was proof that I mattered. Of course, word of that event reached my family. My son called the next day, his voice laced with anger. "You're embarrassing us. Do you even realize how this looks? Like you've forgotten your own blood." I took a deep breath. No, I haven't forgotten. I've been reminded. Every missed holiday, every unanswered call. I remember exactly who was there and who wasn't. His silence on the line told me I had struck a truth he didn't want to admit. He ended the call quickly, leaving me staring at the phone with a strange mix of sadness and relief. By February, the community center started planning a new program for women who felt overlooked, women who wanted to rebuild their lives after neglect or loss. They asked me to speak. At first, I wanted to decline. Public speaking wasn't my strength. But then I thought about all the nights I had sat alone, believing I was the only one carrying that weight. Maybe someone else needed to hear that it was possible to reclaim yourself. The night of the event, I stood on a small stage in front of rows of folding chairs. My palms were sweaty, but I steadied myself. I told them about last Christmas, about the empty table, about the moment I decided to stop waiting for love from people who wouldn't give it. I told them how I gave instead to those who showed up. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then one woman stood, clapping. Then another. Soon the sound filled the air. Afterward, women came up to me with their own stories, being dismissed, being ignored, being treated like afterthoughts. They weren't strangers. They were mirrors. Driving home that night, I realized something I hadn't before. My act of giving hadn't just saved me. It had given permission for others to imagine a different way forward. But with every step I took toward healing, my family dug in harder. By March, my daughter filed paperwork, pushing for a court review of my decisions. My lawyer wasn't rattled, but I was. Not because I feared losing, but because of the lengths she was willing to go. It was one thing to be absent. It was another to fight me in public as though I were an obstacle, not a mother. The first hearing was scheduled for spring. I remember standing in the courtroom, listening to her lawyer speak about me like I was incapable, careless, vulnerable. My daughter sat across the aisle, not meeting my eyes. My lawyer stood and countered every point with calm facts. At the end, the judge dismissed their claims. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt no triumph, only clarity. If my own daughter could put me on trial to secure what she thought was hers, then I owed it to myself to stop hoping she would turn into someone else. I had to let go of the version of her I carried in my heart. That night, I walked through my home touching the framed photos on the walls. I didn't take them down, but I no longer clung to them like proof of love. They were memories, not promises. The love I sought now was alive, breathing, present. It was at the shelter, the library, the community center, the neighbor's porch. Spring came, and with it, a peace I hadn't known in years. My family's calls grew fewer. Their letters slowed. Not because they had accepted my choices, but because they had lost their grip on me. And when that grip loosened, I finally felt free. So let's get into how life carried forward once the courtroom chapter ended. When spring gave way to summer, I noticed that the rhythm of my days no longer carried the weight of waiting. My phone stayed quiet most evenings, and instead of bracing for disappointment, I embraced the stillness. The silence that once made me feel abandoned now felt like proof that I was free to choose how my time was spent. At the shelter, I volunteered more hours than before. I helped with cooking, sorting clothes, even tutoring children after school. Each small interaction reminded me that giving wasn't about money alone, it was about being present. When I looked into the faces of people who felt forgotten, I saw reflections of the woman I used to be, and with each handshake, each laugh, each thank you, I knew I wasn't forgotten anymore. One afternoon in June, the library hosted an event to celebrate the first graduating class from its new senior program. They invited me to speak again. Standing at the podium, I thought about the years I had hidden behind other people's choices, believing their neglect defined my worth. Now I spoke with a voice steady and certain. What matters isn't who walked away, I told them. What matters is who stood by your side when you felt invisible. The applause that followed felt like a wave carrying me forward. Still, the absence of my family left shadows. On birthdays, on anniversaries, I felt the hollow ache of what should have been. I didn't pretend those feelings weren't there. I let myself grieve quietly, but I didn't let grief consume me. Instead, I poured that ache into building stronger ties with the people who had chosen to be in my life. By July, my daughter called again, though this time her voice sounded different, less sharp, more tired. "Mom," she said, "the kids keep asking about you. Can we visit?" I agreed, but I set a boundary. "If you come, come with respect. I won't have another conversation about money. If you come, it's to see me, not what you think belongs to you." She hesitated, then said, "Okay." When they arrived, I opened the door to my grandchildren rushing into my arms. Their laughter filled the house, and for a moment I felt a glimpse of the holidays we once shared. My daughter sat at the table quietly, watching. Eventually she said, "You seem happier." "I am," I answered simply, "because I stopped begging for love and started living in it." She nodded, though her eyes held something I couldn't read, maybe regret, maybe disbelief. But for once, I didn't twist myself into knots trying to fix it. I let her sit with her own thoughts while I focused on the joy bouncing through my living room. That summer brought more gatherings at my house, but they weren't defined by who didn't show up. They were defined by who did. Neighbors, friends, volunteers, even strangers who had become dear to me. My dining room stayed full, not with obligation, but with choice. By autumn, the community center asked if I would consider funding a scholarship program. It felt like the natural next step. I agreed, and when the first students received their awards, I watched their families cry tears of relief. In that moment, I realized the full circle of my decision. The money I once guarded for people who had treated me as an afterthought now carried weight in lives where it was treasured. The calls from my family became less frequent. They hadn't softened entirely, but they no longer fought as fiercely. Maybe they realized they couldn't undo what I'd done. Maybe they saw that my resolve wouldn't break. Whatever the reason, the pressure eased. That Christmas, a year after the one that had broken me open, I set the table again. This time it wasn't for family who never arrived. It was for the family I had built, a patchwork of neighbors, friends, and strangers who had become something more. We ate, we laughed, we told stories that wove together into a kind of belonging I hadn't thought possible. As I looked around the table, I felt the truth settle inside me. I had given away $500,000, yes, but more importantly, I had given myself the life I deserved. Not a life of waiting, not a life of silence, but a life full of people who truly cared. And that was the justice I hadn't even known I was searching for. If my journey from loneliness to self-worth spoke to you, you'll want to hear what happened next. Click through for the powerful story, They Said Merry Christmas as a Joke. I replied with $50,000 in cash to strangers, where one bold act of generosity turned silence into astonishment.